The statement came quietly but carried unmistakable weight. In Beijing, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs convened its regular press briefing, where spokesperson Guo Jiakun was asked about the latest wave of US sanctions targeting Russia's oil sector. His response was clear, calm, and deliberate. The kind of phrasing that diplomats use when they intend to send a firm message without raising their voice. China consistently opposes unilateral sanctions that are not based on international law and are not authorized by the United Nations Security Council, Guo said. Behind that sentence lies an increasingly tense global standoff. Washington's new restrictions are aimed at further isolating Moscow's energy exports, the financial lifeline that keeps Russia's war effort in Ukraine running. The US Treasury has expanded its blacklist of tankers, brokers, and shipping networks that help move Russian crude around the world, tightening what officials call a pressure campaign to erode Moscow's revenues. But from Beijing's perspective, this kind of economic weaponization undermines the very foundations of international order. Inside China's foreign ministry, officials have long argued that unilateral measures, those imposed without UN authorization, violate sovereign equality and destabilize global trade. They see the United States as overreaching, using sanctions not as a tool of justice, but as a lever of power. For China, opposing such actions isn't only about defending Russia, it's about defending a principle. And that principle is simple, that no country should act as judge and jury over the rest of the world. In recent months, Washington has escalated its efforts to close loopholes in the oil sanctions regime. The so-called shadow fleet of tankers, many of them owned by shell companies in Asia or the Middle East, has continued to move millions of barrels of Russian crude each day, often under murky arrangements involving third-party intermediaries. The US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, has warned that any entity facilitating these shipments could face secondary sanctions. That means Chinese firms, insurers, or shipping agents could be at risk if found dealing with Russian cargoes above the Western-imposed price cap. Beijing's opposition, therefore, is not just rhetorical, it's also self-interested. China remains one of Russia's largest energy customers, importing record volumes of crude oil, coal, and gas since the war began. While official trade statistics frame these transactions as legitimate commercial exchanges, Western analysts see them as a crucial financial cushion for the Kremlin. Yet from Beijing's point of view, such trade is fully lawful, conducted under long-term contracts, settled in yuan, and outside the jurisdiction of Western sanctions. Diplomatically, China has tried to maintain a delicate balance. It presents itself as neutral in the Ukraine conflict, repeatedly calling for peace talks and a political settlement. But its rhetoric has consistently tilted against Washington's punitive measures. In February, China's top diplomat Wang Yi condemned what he called the Cold War mentality of bloc confrontation. Today, Guo Jiakun's remarks echo that same theme, that sanctions and isolation rather than dialogue and compromise only prolong the conflict. In Washington, however, the response to such criticism is dismissive. US officials argue that without sanctions, Moscow would have far more resources to sustain its aggression. They insist the restrictions are working, pointing to reduced oil revenues in Russia's budget and growing logistical strain on its export system. For the Biden administration, and now under Trump's second term, foreign policy realignment, sanctions remain a core instrument of coercive diplomacy. Still, the Chinese position resonates with many countries outside the Western alliance system. Across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, there's growing fatigue with what some call sanctions fatigue. Nations that once quietly went along with US measures now question their legality and effectiveness. Beijing often uses that sentiment to position itself as a defender of the global South, a nation that, in its words, upholds fairness and justice in international affairs. Guo Jiakun's choice of words, not based on international law, is significant. It reflects Beijing's consistent interpretation of legitimacy through the United Nations framework, where China wields veto power as a permanent Security Council member. Any action taken outside that framework, Chinese officials say, lacks authority. That's why, for instance, China continues to trade with countries under Western embargoes, from Iran to Venezuela, arguing that if the UN hasn't sanctioned them, no other state has the right to interfere. The reaction within Chinese state media was swift. Within hours, outlets such as CCTV and the Global Times amplified Guo's statement, framing it as evidence of China's independent foreign policy. Commentaries describe the US sanctions as hegemonic tools used to maintain global dominance. Editorials argued that such behavior only encourages countries to build alternative financial systems and that the future of global trade will increasingly bypass the dollar. Indeed, that shift is already underway. China and Russia have deepened their energy cooperation through yuan-denominated settlements. The Power of Siberia gas pipeline continues to expand, and maritime oil shipments to Chinese refineries have hit record highs. Each deal that avoids the US financial system reduces Washington's leverage, a quiet structural change in global economics that sanctions may actually accelerate. At the same time, Beijing is careful not to appear as Moscow's outright ally. Chinese diplomats avoid endorsing Russia's military actions in Ukraine and instead emphasize sovereignty and negotiation. But Western capitals see through that ambiguity. They accuse China of giving rhetorical cover to Russia, supplying dual-use technology, and providing diplomatic shield in international forums. In the eyes of Washington and Brussels, China's opposition to sanctions translates to indirect support for the Kremlin. On the streets of Beijing, however, the public discussion is framed differently. Many ordinary citizens see US sanctions as another example of double standards, one set of rules for the West, another for everyone else. Social media commentary often links the issue to broader grievances, semiconductor restrictions, tariffs, and export controls that Washington has imposed on China itself. For them, the sanctions on Russia are not just about oil. They're part of a wider strategy to contain China's rise. Within China's academic and policy circles, analysts interpret this moment as the maturation of a new global alignment. They speak of sanctions fatigue among non-Western states and a gradual erosion of American financial dominance. Think tanks in Beijing argue that overuse of sanctions will push more nations to develop parallel payment systems, whether through digital currencies, bilateral clearing mechanisms, or the BRICS-led alternatives to SWIFT. Each incremental step weakens Washington's ability to use the dollar as a foreign policy weapon. For Chinese policymakers, opposing sanctions is therefore strategic. It signals defiance, but also prudence, a reminder that China still sees stability as essential for its economic growth. The country depends heavily on energy imports, and disruptions in the oil market can hurt its recovery. So while Beijing defends Moscow's right to trade, it also urges restraint to prevent a broader market shock. In global energy circles, the ripple effects are already visible. Russian crude now flows eastward in unprecedented volumes. India, too, has become a major buyer, refining discounted barrels for re-export. The so-called sanctions-resilient trade network, linking ports from Primorsk to Qingdao, represents a quiet challenge to Western economic control. Each ship that sails under a non-Western flag tells a story of adaptation and defiance. Beijing's opposition statement, then, is not just diplomacy, it's also economic signaling. It reassures Chinese refiners and importers that trade with Russia will continue, even amid Western scrutiny. It also reminds the world that China, the world's largest energy consumer, will not accept disruptions dictated by others. In essence, Guo Jiakun's words encapsulate a broader worldview that multipolarity, not unilateralism, should define international relations. Over the next days, the statement will likely reverberate through foreign ministries across Asia and Europe. Some will interpret it as China tightening its strategic partnership with Russia. Others will see it as a reaffirmation of Beijing's long-standing principles. Either way, the message is unmistakable. China will not be lectured on whom it trades with, nor will it recognize sanctions that bypass the UN system. The timing of the statement also matters. It comes just weeks before a scheduled summit of the BRICS plus nations, where economic sovereignty and de-dollarization will top the agenda. Russia's foreign minister is expected to attend, and Chinese delegates are likely to push for mechanisms that reduce vulnerability to Western restrictions. Guo's remarks effectively preview that agenda, anchoring China's position ahead of multilateral discussions. Western diplomats, meanwhile, will continue to debate how to interpret Beijing's posture. Is it a principled stand or pragmatic self-interest, a shield for Moscow or a statement of independence? For now, the answer lies somewhere in between. What's clear is that as the sanctions landscape expands, so too does global resistance to it. And China is positioning itself at the forefront of that resistance, not as an outlier, but as a spokesperson for an emerging majority. The story of these sanctions and of China's opposition to them is not just about oil. It's about who gets to write the rules of global commerce. For a century, that authority has rested largely with the United States and its allies. But as China's economy grows and its partnerships widen, the balance of influence begins to tilt. Today's statement from Beijing is a small but telling moment in that shift, a reminder that power, like oil, flows to where the demand is greatest and the resistance most determined. And as the cameras switched off in Beijing's Foreign Ministry press hall, the message lingered. China will continue to buy what it needs, trade with whom it chooses, and speak against what it sees as unilateral coercion. The words may have been diplomatic, but the meaning was unmistakably political. A quiet defiance expressed in the polished cadence of officialdom, echoing far beyond the walls of the briefing room.